I love coming over to SA. I grew up on the border, spent time at Apsley and at Strathdownie, and the sort of hackles ride on the back of my neck a bit coming over here because I played plenty of footy and I've been poked by lots of mums' umbrellas as I come off the ground a few times. But we're all part of a great industry, and seriously, SA, you are on the job at the moment. You're going to hear about your sheep sort of blueprint after lunch, and you've got a lot of people here that want to see your sheep industry really perform. You got government support, you got people on the ground, there's lots of opportunity. And what Robert Herman's going to talk about next is the land of opportunity and what we need to do to harness that. So the idea of our first couple of presentations this morning is to try and throw a bit of food for thought in, and hopefully by lunchtime you've locked onto some things you can do to take the next step in your great enterprise and in our great industry. What the theme really of my presentation's really around reproduction. I've spent a lot of my time sort of working in that space and tracking what's happening with reproduction rate in the national flock over time. And basically historically we're about an 80% marking rate flock, and if you look at the last 7 or 8 dots on that, it's jumped up to about 90. There was a big review of that done just recently, and not a lot of backslapping should be going on, because half of the reason that jumped like that is because we've doubled the number of non-merino ewes. We used to be an 85% merino ewe flock, 15% non-merino, and now we're 70-30, and that explains about half of that gain. So that's a structural shift in the industry. Then the other half is explained by some improvement in on-farm practices and adoption of things that we've been widely promoting, which I'll talk about, and a run of better seasons up until the years that aren't really summarised on that graph. Well, the last dot on there is 18-19. I've got to follow up Kimble Curtis and get the 19-20 and so on, but. If you see other data reported, I just want to mention the MLA AWI survey runs about 7% above that because 2,000 farmers volunteer to put in the data, so it's quite a bit of bias. So it's good for trends, but it's not good for the overall average. What I want to do is have a quick talk about where the industry's at. So what I've plugged in here is where the flock's at, the number of ewes are at, that average marking rate. But what's actually in there is the predicted turnoffs that MLA have said this year of 4% lift, I think it was, in number of lambs turned off to 21 odd million, 2% up in sheep slaughter, 2% up in live exports. But what they also said was the flock's going to go up by 6%. And at the current marking rates, that ain't going to happen. We're going to be lucky to maintain status quo. The only way to get that flock to jump by 6%, changing that bottom number from 64 million to 67 million, is an industry average marking rate of 100%. So we need more than half of the farmers in the 100% club. And that's never happened before. And there's absolutely, it is doable. But I think their modelling's probably based, that 7% difference in those couple of slides, or 10% difference, is probably a lot of their work's modelling is based on the survey that I mentioned. But in reality, we've got to do better at converting our potential into live lambs. And so in 2021, you know, we're all good at cards. We've got to work out how we're going to build our deck. And today I don't have time to cover all these in full detail. There's a couple of you in the audience that have seen me talk on components of this before. I'm going to mainly talk about the breeding component today and then follow that up with the activity. But I just want to spend a moment in particular on the first section on finding your opportunities and just give you a little bit more of an insight as to where we sit as an industry in this space. So currently per 100 ewes, we're scanning 130 fetuses, and yes, they're alive. This scanning's done about day 90 of pregnancy, and on average we're marking 90 lambs. So between then and then is about a 3-month period that we're losing 30% of our potential. Not sure we can continue to put up with that. Across all sheep types, the average is about 40 lambs lost per 100 ewes. Merinos, it goes from 120 to 80, 40. The average first cross ewes, 150 to 110, 40. So lamb loss is not a merino industry problem, it's a whole of sheep industry challenge. But it's one that we can absolutely address. And the reason we've got this wastage is these are the average survivals of singles and twins. But if you look at the change in those numbers, we've got whole farms with across all sheep types being able to achieve these sorts of lamb survival rates. And that means from here, you get well into the 100% club, reducing this wastage significantly. So we're going from more lamb loss back to core lamb loss. It can absolutely be done. You know, there's a farm not far up the road in Balmoral that's consistently going less than 10%. That's in a meat composite sheep. But there's plenty of merino flocks that commercially that are achieving this sort of result. So what I want to do for a moment, that's for you to think about your flock, but at an industry level, there is not one opportunity that comes near this. Not one. At a current 30% lamb loss that I showed in the previous 2 slides ago, to come back to a 10 or 12% lamb loss, if that was adopted right across the industry and we assign a value on those extra lambs after the cost of production, so it's a net price of about $100 a lamb, that's worth $1 billion in lost profit per annum in a $7 to $8 billion industry. We've got to stop what's slipping through our fingers on our individual farms and as an industry. That's the only way we're going to rebuild the flock, and it's the key way we can have our cake and eat it too and keep sustaining markets but also sustain and grow our flock. And we've got to get focused as an industry from the top to the bottom. We sort of keep hitting this problem with a lettuce leaf. We've got to get seriously focused. There isn't another thing that's got $1 billion of wastage going from current practice to best practice in the industry. It's huge. And another way of presenting that is this question. And so I'm honing back to your commercial farm. I want to come out of the clouds and think about your commercial flocks. What percentage of the ewes that are joined each year actually rear a lamb? So it's not your marking percentage. It's of the 100 or 1,000 ewes that go to the ram, what percentage of those ewes actually rear a lamb? I don't mind if they scanned with 3 and reared 1, she still reared a lamb. Or scanned with 2 and reared 1, she still reared a lamb. The definition of a ewe, as far as I see it, would be to reproduce and have young. Otherwise, we might as well just call her a wether. What do you reckon that percentage is on your farm? Throw up some numbers. What percentage of your ewes that are joined actually rear a lamb? Throw me up a number. Someone in the room, early bid. I'm going to have to get the agent back up if I can't get any action. Come on, you're all running your own flocks. Throw us up a number. What percentage of your ewes do you reckon actually rear, that are joined, rear a lamb? 85. Good, big, bold, early bid. Now, if he knows his number, and it is 85, I'm telling you what, I'm giving him a hat. Because that's right up the pointy end. And most of the audiences I present in front of say 85, 90, 95, and they're not really thinking about the number. So I've done this on a 1,000 ewe basis, and you can scale it up or down to your relevant flocks. But on average, 10% of ewes scan dry, so there's 100 that don't rear. On average, 6% of breeding ewes die, and most of that death is in the last month of pregnancy and throughout lambing. So 6% of 900. If in the quickness of time, I won't go through this step by step, but I apply the lamb survivals I showed you before, it means out of the 1,000 ewes, over 300 of them don't rear a lamb, 2/3 of them do. So we've got all this discussion about the flock and the regrowth, yet 1/3 of our national flock is glorified wethers as far as our ewe flock goes. Sure, they produce a bit of wool, but given that 30% of them aren't that good for wool anymore, they've got to produce lambs or there's no pathway to profit. We've got to start working on this number. So have a think about in your flock where your opportunity lies, and 85% is doable because best practice is just above that. We can get our scanning rates quite high, we can reduce our ewe deaths, and we can improve those lamb survivals. But we can also do this at good whole farm stocking rates. This is not about a fat ewe project. This is about you having a real crack on your commercial farm. But in order to pull that off, you've got to design the right animal. And we're not quite as bad as the beef industry, but we're only one step away from it. Too much, you know, I'm not saying we're as bad as Parliament at the moment, but too much focus on the boys. All right, a lot of blokes measuring lots of rams, talking about rams with big butts and high fleece weights. The jewel in this crown is the female. She runs on your farm 365 days of the year, rain, hail or shine. okay, whether you feed her on time or you don't. You're not out there to keep the fox away every night that she lambs. She's got to do a period where she's got to suck it up, buttercup. And we have to design animals with this highly variable environment that can cope. But we have an industry at the moment that is seriously at the crossroads. Really at the crossroads. We've talked about Mount Lamb loss and the knowledge gap that sits behind that. We're working on it. Dead Sheep Creek represents the adult sheep death. Weaner Cliff is the post-weaner loss of merino weaners. Just been a brilliant piece of research done in the last year or so telling us what are the traits that exacerbate weaner loss. Guess what? The worst trait is yielding clean fleece weight. What we do as a sheep industry is we get stuck on market signals. Got to cut more wool was the call of the day. If I go to another Bendigo sheep and wool sale and I walk through that shed again and they're all the highest extreme wool cut sheep, every one of them is a single ram that looked good at weaning, it makes me sick. It's not the pathway to taking us to the next step. Because pushing extreme wool cutting when we had 55 million wethers and more consistent seasons was an option. Today you have to design an animal that can cope. And we want it to cut an appropriate amount of wool but be able to sustain itself in your commercial environment. And what we need to keep an eye on is our fitness levels and how the animal is telling us it's going in our natural environment. And we're about to get a new market signal on lean meat yield. And if I'm wound up about the correlation between wool cut and fat is minus 0.2, it's a moderate unfavourable correlation. The correlation between lean meat yield and fat is minus 0.8, 4 times worse. If we go chasing this trait in our maternal sheep, I'm telling you we might as well pack up. Our flock's going to go backwards, backwards, backwards. You'll end up having to lock them up like Frisian cows and cart the feed to them. We've got to have natural fat and natural size of the fuel tank in its animal relative to its surface area, and I'll talk to it more outside and I'll show you a bit of info on that. But have a think about where your opportunity lies. Today I do not have the time to cover targeted feeding and all the education we do there and how we build this pyramid up from scanning, feed, resource allocation throughout here, making sure that the day you scan they're separated and put on different trajectories. That's the key. There's too many people scanning their sheep and then they dot them and they leave them run together and they say I'll separate them later when I do my inoculation. You might as well get rid of half of the reason we scan is to set up ewe condition score and birth weight. The other half of the reason is for paddock allocation. And we need to exploit both. And there's a whole journey there that I don't have time to cover today. And it can make serious differences to ewe and lamb survival. Adaptability is an area I'm really passionate about. Again, it's not a theme that I can cover today because I'm going to spend most of my time in section 4. But we've got to keep designing systems and decisions and practices that make us more adaptable. One of the great things the sheep industry, for example, has now got farms that are for district after district with containment pens. It's the greatest example of adaptable systems because you can use that to protect your landscape in a season like this over here. You can also use it like a good halfback flanker when you want to turn the tide and a bit of early autumn rain comes, you could choose to lock them up to build a feed wedge. So it's an attacking ploy in the one piece of infrastructure. You've heard, those of you that heard me talk before, I liken this section to the gambler, the tune, and it's about building your deck of cards and knowing when to hold them and knowing when to fold them. And a big part of that, Robert Herman, is knowing your stock values. And when they go to decile 1 and there's opportunities to pick the cherries, you do that. You think about how you can do that but still do it in a sustainable manner. So there's a whole lot of things here that go into this. And I'd say number 1 is mindset. Is mindset about thinking about our system and our willingness to be really agile with our decisions and our approach. And if I throw one in that's going to upset people in this room, one thing that I see hurts the flexibility of sheep farms is autumn lambing. I know a lot of you'll be mixed farmers and you think you got a lamb in March, April. I want you to think about the next best time that you can lamb. Maybe it's after you sow the crop and you could lamb in June. Something like that, because we did a big study of mixed farms, 5 or 6 years of benchmarking, and guess what it showed? Benchmarking often concludes reproduction's not important. It often concludes it's all about wool cut. Well, on a 5-year analysis on mixed farms, 80% of the difference between the top profit farms and the rest, and they were all merino enterprises, was their livestock trading profit. How many ewes you run, how many lambs you sold, and what their sale value was. So if that's making 80% of the difference over time, it's because those people, and we studied them, I interviewed these farms, and they were all winter lambing, no autumn, winter or late winter lambing. No autumn lambers were in the top 20% over a 5 or 6 year period. And it's to do with flexibility. So if you want to take me up on that one over the sheep later or have a chat, I'm happy to try and unpack that with you. But I'm not trying to sell a recipe. I want you to think about when would be the next best time to lamb compared to when you currently lamb. And what would be the pros and cons of that. Rather than just this, oh, I can't do that, son. Definitely can't do that. I have to lamb in March around here. I've got to get them on the ground and mark before I put the crop in. And I say, well, do you? Let's think about it. Be very careful with market signals because the agents are going to tell you lambing early you'll top the market. It's about how many kilos you sell and the margin. How many kilos you sell and the margin. It's not about topping the market. So think about that adaptability area. And I have to move on from that because Robert Herman and I were part of a workshop we did that goes for a whole day on that one subject. Breeding for success. Whew. If you reckon I'm passionate about the other subject areas, I am so excited about where the sheep industry has travelled to and where the next opportunity lies in this area. The first main message I want to get across to you is one of the big mistakes we've had with genetics in all industries is they're sold as a tool to drive production. They can equally be used as a tool to control production costs. And so the theme I'm talking about there is maximum ain't necessarily best. Whether it's wool cut, whether it's growth, whether it's whatever trait. We need to try and build an animal that has the robustness and ability to perform in the functional environment, in that commercial environment that you're running them in. So there's 4 or 5 key steps in this. We need to think about our breeding objective and be well informed before we get to setting it. Then once we set our breeding objective, before we buy a new animal, we want to review our current sire team. And we've got some presentations today that will follow in that theme. Then we've got to use the best of the objective and visual information. I'll be direct. I shouldn't breed bash, but if I go to another merino operation where I walk through the rams, and it's not the case here, I don't mean that. Too many flocks in New South Wales. I went to their sales last year during COVID and I'm bidding for farmers because I shifted my base out of Victoria to Queensland. I wouldn't have presented a third of the rams on a few of those flocks. Their pastern and feet set up and the hock set up. My old man, he'd be just tipping over upstairs. I tell you, he was obsessed about structure, probably too far the other way. But reality is the animal's got to walk, whether it's got a great set of figures on visual or raw data, I don't care. They've got to be functional. So this area here in selection is combining the best of the objective and visual information. We have a big problem in the sheep industry. The animals are transacted locked in a pen. In the cattle industry, you're as fat as me, it's 40 degrees in February, we walk them up and down the pen. In the sheep industry, we don't see them walk at the point of transaction, and about 80% of the flocks are still trimming their feet because they're easy to trim compared to bulls, whereas OH&S-wise, a lot of the bull trimming stopped. So there's stuff that's going on here that's not taking us in the right direction. So we've got to get better commercially of how we go around this. And then once we get this new bag of genes, we've got to work on gene flow. No point having the best crop of rams if he doesn't have many live lambs and if you don't give them a chance to flourish in your flock. Got to try and turn the genes over. Doesn't mean you can't have 6-year-old ewes if they're really good ones, but we don't want a flock that's propped up by old rams and really old ewes because that's the only way they can sustain their numbers, because that blows out generation interval and slows genetic gain. So if we're going to get into informing our breeding objective, we must have an eye for where our income comes from. Is it wool? Is it meat? Is it surplus ewes? What's the balance? You know, and when we first started Bred Well Fed Well, and I can mention a name, the first workshop we did was way up in the New England tablelands at Martin Oppenheimer's. Martin loves his wool. You've probably seen him be quite parochial about wool over the years. And he had a 6,000 ewe commercial flock. And we have a little calculator called the meat to wool ratio. And I said, oh, I need to know where you're at. He said, I'll tell you at Smoko, but he said, I reckon it's 60-40 towards wool over meat. Guess what? He did the calculations. I yelled out, what is it? He said, it's 60-40 the other way around. Too many merino farmers, if I bump into you in the street and I say, what are you, son, or what are you, daughter? Used to be, I'm a wool grower, son. I call bull dust to that. You're this person that's got this fantastic dual-purpose animal that can produce wool, lambs, mutton and surplus ewes. Be proud of all four components because that's what sets you apart from old mate with the shedding flock. Okay, but we need to make decisions that enable total productivity. You're no longer just a wool grower, son. We've got to move past that mentality because there's a big opportunity in both that area and other areas. There's ways to benchmark your flock, which we're hearing about the flock profiling work today. What I'm going to talk a little bit more just now is about the third one there, the auditing your fitness levels. And the reason that there's the meat to wool calculator. The reason that I want to talk about auditing your fitness levels and all this stuff about informing your breeding objective is us blokes are terrible. When we sit down in a room and I say, what do you want to select for? It's always more of everything. It's like Jonas. I'm the last of 6 kids. She was the best cook known to man. I'll have more of that sponge cake, Joan. Don't worry about that. I'll have more growth. I'll have more wool cut. I'll have more lambs. Think about the breeding ewe and what you're actually doing with her in your production environment. And we call fitness the ability of the animal to survive, grow and reproduce in a particular environment. So I need you to do this audit before you buy more rams this year and get to the sale. The blokes in the red coats are out the back and saying, look at all this wool cut, look at all this growth. You know, and he's presented all the single, well-fed, shed-prepared rams up front, and the best one for you is lot 86 right out the back. You must do your homework and go through this. What's your fitness levels? What are you scanning? What are you marking? What's your wastage? Because an extra kilo of wool ain't going to help that equation, I can tell you. What's your weaner survival rates? What's your maiden ewe performance? The industry average is worse than 20% difference in marking rate between the maiden and the adult. The farmers I've seen redesign their merinos, their maidens scan within about 5% of their adults, on occasions better, because they bred them right and they manage them right. You can get their marking easy within 10%. We got a problem. We need the AWI and the merino industry to have a maiden ewe campaign, because if you want the merino flock to rebuild, there's more of a proportion of merino to merino maiden matings on maiden ewes than ever while this flock's in rebuild. Yet they got the worst marking rate. How's that going to work for the rebuild of merino ewe numbers? Ewe survival rates, same thing in the adults, got to work through it. This is the one that interests me, is the ability of the animal to maintain condition score, particularly under nutritional stress. And I've got 2 messages in one slide to illustrate this. What I've plotted here is fleece weight to body weight ratio against condition score of a heap of weather teams from the Peter Westblade trial. And 80% of the variation in condition score is explained by this. And I'm going to actually illustrate a bit of this equally out with the breeding values on the young sheep. If you pile lots of wool on a small body, you are going to compromise condition score. And then if I come out of that data and look at this, these are at a sire evaluation site. Same nutrition, same age. Both of them are by sires that are plus 24 for yield and clean fleece weight, which is well above industry average. This one's 4 for growth, this one's 8 for growth. This one's -1 for muscle and fat, this one's +1 for muscle and fat. You know the difference in condition score, same age? 2.2 score, 3.7, 1.5 spread. 1.5 spread in the weathers. What the research in Armidale tells us is that 25% of condition score is set by genes. We've got to work out how to breed a balanced animal, because this focus on per head yielding clean fleece weight is insane, because I can tell you which one's going to cut more wool out of those sheep. They're going to die at about 10%. Post-weaning, they'll be lucky to die at 2%. No one shears dead sheep anymore. Got to come out of this per head thinking and think about your whole farm system. Tensile strength in a 2.2 score, shithouse. 3.5 score, magnificent. So we've got to look at the balance of traits in these animals and not fall in love with one avenue. And your income streams are telling you that anyway. So setting your breeding objective, you must know your track, how you're going to run the animal around that track, particularly the breeding ewes, and the races you're targeting. The problem we get is farmers fall in love with market signals, like go fine or go broke. I watched lots of farms in my proud Western Victoria. You know what they did? They listened to one market signal, they went fine, but it wasn't so much as whether the wool market and what it did, it's that they put all their eggs in one basket. And they ended up engineering an animal that was slower growing. It was lower in fitness. It had lower reproduction rates. All these things that went with it that actually reduced the adaptability and the flexibility of their systems because they locked onto one market signal and single trait select. I see it with wool cut. I also see it with growth. And we need to design a balanced animal that can flourish in your commercial environments. Farmers that have come out of bred wool, fed wool have set their breeding objective. The biggest emphasis there was on reproduction. They still want a merino ewe that cuts wool. She's a good doer and her lambs grow quite quick. That's basically the breeding objective. When you set your breeding objective, it's about selecting genes that are firstly fit for farm and fit for market. It's all about balance. It's not about extremes. It's about creating an animal that can flourish in your environment that generates a heap of product to sell. That's what we want. And I don't have too much time to finish up, but I want to make sure I present this slide. Do not be a sheep and just blindly follow the flock. Because this is what's happening. This is the 50 percentile for the merino industry percentile band. So what's happened since 1990 whenever the system got going. And I can draw you a picture of what's happened with this animal and what's going to happen if we keep going down this pathway. They got on 18% increase in wool cut. We've seen lots of people chasing extra staple length, but 18% for wool cut, more growth, and they've done 1% gain in reproduction in 20 or 30 years and gone hardly anywhere for carcass. You know what that means? That's almost the same as 600-day weight when the old man was around when breed plan got tarted. The animal's going to get taller and narrower, and eventually you could split a raindrop on its back. Is that going to create an animal that has the ability to store body reserves, feed the wool follicle, sustain growth and reproduction? Absolutely not. The reason why these animals are going further down this pathway is the nutrition that's provided on seed stock farms is atypical to your commercial farms. So they can get away with an animal that I believe is heading in a really imbalanced direction. Now, it's going to upset a heap of people, and I don't get too many Christmas cards from stud breeders, but to be frank, I don't give a shit. I actually don't care. 1 ounce. And he put up the sign to finish, so it's probably about time. And if John Sutherland was here, he would have said, you've just had another foot fault, son. I'm interested in you and your commercial farms and actually making progress in a manner that takes you forward. Those rams you buy, they're only a means to an end. They're only a means to an end. You just got to get on with harvesting the right genes to take you forward, and then it's over to you. You know, I see Pat Brown in the front here, and he'd be saying, Trompf, you didn't mention. They've got to be up to scratch with their management. And at the moment, in my finishing thing, is why we have so much wastage is not only do the ewes need redesigning, but currently less than 20% of Australia's ewes have their nutrition tailored to their requirement, made up by the numbers of farmers that scan for multiples, that then differentially manage and hit condition score targets. You've got to have the management to follow it. It's got to be all about bred well and fed well. I hope you enjoyed today. I'll stop at that point before I upset the half a dozen stud breeders that I can see in the room. But it's all about you and your farm and your lot in life, and I want you to be focused. And one of the reasons bred well, fed well's made a lot of difference in this industry, it's empowered you to rock the cage. Have your own plan and then push back and say, this is what I'm really chasing, what progress are you making in this area, how can we work together? And so thanks, and look forward to seeing you throughout the day.